Hello, hello, and welcome. One of our favourite topics in the context of creating win-win outcomes for people and from people and with people. I think it's an exciting topic to talk about sales because there is a lot of misconceptions around what sales and influence actually means. And so I've got a really important question to start off for you, actually, Brad. I think the question is, are people selling the way people buy? And so when we look at the way in which people are interacting, there's often an agenda. And so the question I have for you today is, how can salespeople assess whether or not their sales approach is actually aligning with the way that modern buyers are making decisions and saying yes?
Good question. And again, I think it comes back down to that generally when we look at sales, it always will be a numbers game. So unless you're measuring, you're probably not getting the feedback in there. And then once you've got the numbers sorted out, the only thing that's left there to making sure that you're getting the results and being able to get that feedback, and obviously looking at making sure your process is really making sure you're doubling down on that human connection and making sure that you're really getting in there and finding out the impact that your product makes and articulating that, and that leads to the emotional buy-in. Okay, so if you're competing on price, it's a race to the bottom, and that's all you've got is price to compete on. So a lot of the times people are stuck in that. They do the process of discounting, thinking that's how they're going to win the sale, but it's just a race to the bottom. You really want to make sure that you're looking at the modern process, which is where people buy people, always has been that scenario. A lot of times people get caught up in features and benefits, and yes, they're important in that process, but making sure that you're getting that feedback that the client understands the impact your product or service makes to the business. Working with a number of different businesses, but certainly in the context of professional people, we worked with a client recently who was an engineer, engineers in the space doing sales, lawyers in the space doing, obviously a concept of acquiring clients, and understanding that process of really being able to communicate to the level where the person gets the product. And it's a fine line between being an expert in your field. We find some professional services, they're absolutely full of product knowledge and excellent at doing that. And their knowledge is so many logical levels above where the client is. They have a bit of a hard time relating that, coming back to it. So a great way of being able to do that is making sure that you're getting into and really articulating and making sure you've got feedback that the impact your product makes is the difference that makes the difference. So I think it's a really important thing to go through and get clarity on that.
Sales was, is, and always will be a numbers game, and the nature in which people go on a buying journey definitely has changed. I think we've seen, some of the things that have changed economic conditions over the last 5 to 10 years. Obviously a pandemic doesn't happen every day, but that certainly gave people time to reflect. Technology has had a big influence in the way that people access things and how quickly they can access it. And of course, the internet is vast with rich information, of which some of it you have to fact check, but there's certainly no shortage of the way in which we can gain information and do our research and how we can buy. And so I think when people assume that the simple things that they did 10 years ago in order to generate business, whether it's a multinational, a big global corporation, or whether it's a small business, I think anyone who's not paying attention to the fact that things are changing risks irrelevance. And so they risk being left behind. I mean, there's a reason we don't have dinosaurs anymore. And so it's a little bit like Darwinian theories, for those of you that remember your science classes, in that it's the survival of the fittest. And so even though sales has some foundations that will never really change, if businesses aren't being proactive in being able to look at how they can innovate and listen to their marketplaces, then they're not going to evolve. And this is why we've seen many businesses potentially, go to their end or meet their end in extinction, because as our buyers evolve, the needs for our sales messaging to be transformed actually needs to adapt to meet the customers and the prospects for where they're at. And different people will have different buying journeys and different criteria to meet. So I think it's really important that we are continually testing and measuring to see, is the way we're doing it still landing, and what small tweaks can we make to ensure that the customer behavior is where it needs to be and that it becomes and remains a win-win-win scenario.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to get to understand that for sure.
A buyer's journey has changed, and I think here's what it means for anyone who is selling a product, service. The journey that we saw even just 5 years ago or 10 years ago, not to mention 30 years ago, was that generally people, would have a motivation to actually get something, and then they'd go on a research, speak to many different people, and they had an agenda to be able to run their checks. And today's buying journey is just not linear. People are so much more educated in terms of what they need to know about the products and services that they're buying. They're less open to being talked to about things that they hadn't thought of. So generally they tend to be, by the time they get to you, they've spent a lot of time doing their own self-education, whether that's through the internet or talking to people. And of course, social proof is a massive one, whether that's through conversation or whether that's through, looking at what's on the internet, etc. And so I think what we're seeing is that technology and the ease of information is playing a much bigger role long before you might even be talking to your prospect. And this is where the ZMOT study, or the Google Zero Moment of Truth, is so relevant, because the Google study, Zero Moment of Truth, or the ZMOT study, understood that people need 7 to 11 hours. I beg your pardon. They need 7 hours with you. They need 11 touch points over 4 different platforms. So if you're not out there showing people what you can do in many different ways, and providing information that they can access even when you're not there, whether that's as simple as a text message that links them somewhere, a telephone call to touch base. It could be, information on your blog posts or on your website. It might be digital content that they can consume, much what you're looking at right now. People are wanting to actually sell themselves before they even talk to you. And in some cases, they don't even want to talk to you. So the medium of just cold calling or just doing face-to-face visits in sales is definitely gone. I think it still has its place. And there's certainly a lot of people out there that are doing cold calling and standing out from the crowd, because there are so many more people less willing to do that right now. However, a one-trick pony in sales is definitely not going to work anymore. While it might have worked 10 or 15 years ago, and before that, it's certainly a non-linear process. And rather than a funnel, we're seeing people come into your buying strategy at different times. So I think one of the things about this is that timing obviously plays a role in the buying journey as well. So when we think about the role that timing and messaging play in influencing buyers at any stage of their buying journey, what do you think about that, Brad? Like, what are some of the key factors?
Look, I think that the number one factor that's very, very clear when it comes to timing, and the statistics are out there, because of so much information and the speed at which information takes place, from the time a client inquires to the time you actually make contact with them, needs to be as fast as possible, in as much real time as possible. That's one thing that's absolutely for sure. And again, that can, if you don't have a qualification process and you're spinning the wheels with lots of conversations with people, and you're getting lots of inquiries to people who aren't your ideal client, then it may be the situation that you're spending a lot of time having conversations with the wrong person. But if you are having the conversation with the right person, and your marketing's working well, where you're getting an opportunity where you've got an inbound or a callback in that scenario, then the speed of response is really, really important. So that's whether it be a phone call, such as can, and then again a text message. Making sure that you're setting up the conversation is really important. And the second part of that is making sure that you're building on the urgency. So when someone's made an effort to inquire, and again, this is with inbound leads, for example, when a person made an effort to inquire or reach out to you, there's a level of urgency at that moment in time, which will dissipate over a period of time. So the sooner you can get onto that, and then while you're in that place, you can set up the next step of that sales process, that customer journey, that next touch point. And you can actually go through and keep on that urgency through that process by leaning on it. So, yep, great, let's have a conversation. Thank you for your inquiry. Let's book a time where we can go into a bit more detail. Look, I'm available this afternoon. When's it? And then making sure you're continuing on that relationship of taking people on the journey for the next step. And with that creates the urgency. And when that takes place, I think what you're doing, you're really maximizing the timing that the client came through on that. And of course, the other thing is a really good question to ask is, what's the time frame you're looking at for this product or service to be able to utilize that as well. So the person says, 6 months, it'll be hard to build urgency on tomorrow. But if they said, look, the problem's now, I need to solve it, great. Well, I'm glad you called. Let's make sure we're working on solving that problem as fast as we can. I'll make sure I make it a priority. Here is the next step. Let's get the ball rolling. Chandel, tell me about a little bit about understanding how do you encourage trigger factors in the final buying decision?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the triggers for buying is that they're never really exactly the same for everybody. And, I'll sort of pre-frame this next comment to remember that not everybody buys the same, and we don't want one trick ponies. We've got human beings, and the same way that we all have different features, we all have different motivations too. So I think it's really important to remember that when we're looking at how to I guess get the triggers come up in terms of the final buying decision. Emotions are a big part of the way in which people make the decision to buy. And so when we have things like FOMO or the need for security, or we have a status, those types of things can heavily influence purchasing decisions. However, I think the thing that, rather than looking for a, paint by numbers sort of strategy, what we need to move away from is putting it into a box and going, well, I'm going to use this type of closing strategy or this kind of trigger. I think what we actually just have to remember is that people buy emotionally first, and then they look to justify their decisions logically. So there are some salespeople that overdo the logical fact sell, and they neglect to remember that there's a person in front of them, and that person probably had a pain point or a gain point that they were interested in solving or adding to when they did their research and reached out to you. So let's just remember, I think, that the number one trigger behind a buyer's yes is actually about what was the emotional charge behind making that decision.
And I think there is a lot of things that are left out when it comes to this, whether it be on the phone, whether it be face-to-face, or a lot of people are sort of doing discovery calls via Zoom or Teams or Google Meetups, whatever it is in that scenario. There's a lot of opportunity for you to be able to identify and work out what's happening in the client's mind there to effectively. So first and foremost, assuming that the person having the sales conversation is in charge of their state, and they've made sure that they have the belief in their product, they're clear on their communication and the process, they understand the order and sequence of the customer's journey, then with that comes a whole bunch of confidence. And when the person making the sales process has confidence in doing that, that's going to come across. So a lot of the times we come across people who've got poor product knowledge, or a lack or belief that of that product knowledge as being a disadvantage to them. But in today's market, given information so there, often the person's quite researched and probably knows more about your product than you do in some cases, because that's where it is. So I think when we come down to that, it's really looking at, okay, what can I do as an individual, having a conversation to get my message across and how my product or service can benefit them, is really working out how that person makes a decision to buy, and being able to work out what is the decision strategy they have in order for them to have that purchasing process. And believe it or not, we all have a strategy, an order and sequence, a way in which we know we've bought something. And being able to understand and be able to unpack and find that out allows you as a salesperson to have a conversation using that person's language and their own safety factors of what's important to them to fulfill that criteria. Now, it's not a magic trick, it's not any sleight of hand, but it's about being able to communicate your product and service in the same way that that person's language takes on board and makes decisions to buy a product and service. And as long as you meet the criteria of what's, as far as the criteria is what they're looking for, and that can only happen through questions, then you're in a front foot there by making sure that you're setting yourself up for that person walking around and go, wow, that person really got me. They really understood me, and they've hit my emotional sort of factor. I presented the product or service in a way that I understand it. It makes it really easy for them to move on and doing that. And again, what goes without saying is that you need a level of rapport and connection and human connection in that scenario to do that. It's very difficult to elicit and do that well if you haven't actually been a bit more human about the sales process.
I love that. Being more human in the sales process is something that I think everybody can use refreshers on all the time, to be honest. We're not machines. And while we may use the machine to process payments, we certainly don't start there. So much of our communication and our ability to decide whether we like someone or we dislike someone is unconscious and nonverbal. So there are some people that focus a lot on making sure that they're saying the right things at the right time. And the reality is everyone has free will. So if you really don't like someone and you don't want to like them, then that's your choice. And so I think one of the biggest things we have to pay attention to is that there can be a difference in the way somebody receives you. Now, many times, including when I published my book, Confident Closing, we had conversations about things like our tone of voice, the volume of our voice, the way we use our body language, eye contact, facial expression, all those things play a role between the words we use and whether or not the behavior matches the words. And there are some people that can say all the right words, but their behavior says otherwise. And my grandmother, may she rest in peace, used to say, something about their eyes doesn't match what their mouth is saying. And it's been a very, a commonly referred to thing that my grandmother says. And we call that in NLP a sense of congruency. So while you can never force somebody to like you, if they don't want to like you, then they're just not going to like and trust you. However, if you're still building trust with somebody, then some of the ways that you can help that process along is by matching and mirroring their voice tonality, or matching and mirroring their body language or their pace, or, being responsive to their requests and giving their requests to them in a manner by which you know that it's going to land. So for example, if somebody's asked to talk to another client who's had success, then they may not necessarily be able to talk to that client, but you could send them a quote from that person as opposed to just sending them, some data about how successful your program is. So let's start to match and mirror the things that people are looking for from us. And let's make sure that we're utilizing a sense of congruence between the words that we use and the behavior. So for example, if you say you're going to get something to somebody by close of business that day, then send it to them by close of business that day, because otherwise your words won't match your behavior. I think one of the key things when we talk about the psychology of trust and why buyers hesitate in the process is that sometimes there are critical points or milestones we need to hit in the sales process that contribute to those things. So Brad, why is building rapport early in the process so critical to the way that we convert our clients?
I'm sure you've all heard you only get one chance at a first impression, and it's important that you do that. So that's the opportunity to be able to build rapport in that moment in time. So I think the first thing to do is to realize that if you are talking to another human being, is to start off with as talking to another human being, not as a potential anything else other than a human being. So that process is really important, and it sets up so much going forward. So we know that trust is a large part of it being unconscious, and when it comes to building rapport. And a lot of people think rapport is off. Research and find out the person's into golf or whatever they're into and doing, and talk about that. And there's an element of that which is a bit spooky, as well as sort of okay. But it's much better to realize that when you're building trust or about rapport, it's building a connection with that person first and foremost. So it's very, very easy to be able to do that. I was talking to someone recently, and the whole idea of actually being like that person as far as they communicate, as far as slowing down their speed, their tone of voice, their postures, their gestures, just doing that would actually build a level of a rapport. And they were quite skeptical on it. And I said, well, look, go and do it. I'm not talking about mimicking someone. I'm talking about, we call it matching and mirroring. So being like that person in that first moment. and taking that in on board. And as a result, very, very quickly, that person's like, I cannot believe the difference that has made in that. And you can't build rapport at the end of the conversation because it's lost. It's got to be done at the beginning of that process. So it's really important. And again, once you've got that rapport, a couple of things are going to happen. You're probably more likely to have the person feel comfortable to actually give you the real objection that they may have to a product or service. You'll also be in a better place to be able to ask a question to be able to find out the real objection to the product or service towards the end of the conversation if you've done a really good job in building that up. So I think first and foremost, set yourself up for the right intention for the meeting, for the call, but go in there talking to the person as if they are a person, getting to know them and what's important to them first and foremost before you start getting into how your product or service will benefit them.
One of the things that we often talk about when we're doing sales training is how emotions drive decisions, not necessarily the logic. And I think, for anyone listening to the call, sometimes the importance of logic and reason can get lost when we start talking about emotions. We're not negating them. We think they're just as important. But if you lead with that, then you probably find that they'll fall on deaf ears or that they won't have the kind of cut through that you really want when you start to ignore the emotional aspect of it.
And again, in that context of their identity. So, Shondell, what role does identity play in how people emotionally commit to the purchase?
That's such a good question. We could do a whole hour just on that subject, Brad. I think identity is a construct that people create for themselves. And sometimes, depending on what's presented to them or different life events that can go on, people can change what they think their identity is. But, one of the things we talk about in neurolinguistic programming, or NLP for short, is that people have kind of like a selfishness about them. And it's not the kind of selfishness that makes me not want to share my chocolates with you or, not want to break bread with you or anything like that. It's a selfishness in the sense that most people are interested in what's in it for me. And we're seeing this more and more and more as society sort of becomes more connected. There was a Gartner study recently that said that, we're more connected than we've ever been before. And yet the rate of loneliness is higher than it's ever been. And so even though it seems as though we're very connected as a race, many people are quite lonely and they're quite looking at what's going on for me. How do I feel? How does this affect me? And there's always a focus on self. So I think when we think about how this identity plays a role in purchasing, it's really looking at what is in your product and in your customer journey that reinforces what they see their identity or their self-image. Now, you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, but I'm selling to people who sit on boards. Surely they're making decisions for the company and for the best interest of the company. Yes, they are. But if you're talking to a chief financial officer, then one of their biggest objectives is how do I make sure that I convince the board that I've kept costs low over the course of this year so that I look good, that I achieved that. Or if you're talking to a group sales manager and that person is interested in having their sales team do more results, yes, it is about their sales team doing more results. But by them achieving that and hiring a training company that enabled them to do that, then that makes them look like a better sales manager because they found that person. So I think you can see that ultimately there is a sense of identity and self-focus that comes into the buying decision. And if your product or service doesn't have a way to point out how it reinforces their self-image or what they're trying to achieve in their what's in it for me, then you're probably going to be left behind while someone who does understand those things gets in front of you with their buying journey.
And again, they are important factors to be able to cover off the product's features and benefits and the logic behind why someone should buy your product or service. However, the real fact of the matter is that you need to be able to lean on and get into the concept. The emotion is what's going to sell, and it can't be a made up, manipulated process. You've got to ask questions to get in there and find that. And one way of sitting back and looking at that is, again, identifying and working out what is the impact your product or service makes to that customer, and look at it from a point of view as what is the emotional impact, not how it makes their day better. How is it making their day better feel to them? What is it going to make them overcome. They're going to be less stressed, not having fear of making decisions, or whatever it is. It's about making sure that they've got that confidence to go through and doing that. So again, products, features and benefits are all very important. Getting into the details around what's important for your product and answering those questions. Again, given the world we live in today, there's so much content out there and people are across the details, and people will spend a lot of time researching and looking at things, which is by definition details. You can get really, really caught in a conversation about dealing about all the details and all the features and benefits, and guess what? You'll just keep that conversation going forever and ever and ever. And the only way to be able to get to that end point is to be, we refer to it as chunking up, to getting big picture, and that's where those emotions are and what's the benefit for them emotionally, how it's going to serve them. So ask yourself the question, what impact can my product or service make to this person that's going to make their life better, and how can I ask questions to drive that home to make sure that my product or service, the value I'm asking for, exceeds the impact that that's going to make, so that it's a no-brainer. So we know that a lot of the times we can have a hard time identifying and actually finding out objections in a sales process. And we know that sometimes that there are generally only 4 objections, but we don't know which one it is until we're actually able to identify it.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's a really great way to look at it if we actually get the objections. And I know that we've been in situations before where someone won't buy, and then we find out later that there was a reason that they weren't buying, which was actually totally misinformed, that had they have had a conversation with us about that we could have solved that problem for them easily. So, Brad, I know we've talked about this before. Why don't prospects always voice their concerns?
I know, I'm sure every salesperson has a point where they're almost ready to ring the bell because they're so convinced that the conversation went so well, and they're waiting for the order to come through and just hitting send receive because they're still going to send it straight away, and all of a sudden, no. And they go, that's weird. Now, maybe I got my email address wrong. I'll give them a call, and it goes to voicemail. And that's another email, and it goes to voicemail. They're going, hang on a minute. Where'd they go? There was something.
Ghosting.
I've been ghost busted. All right. So in that scenario, it's very, very clear. So I think that a lot of the times when we look at this, it comes back down to a lot of people have got, and I think first and foremost, I'm gonna put the square blame on this scenario straight back onto the salesperson. And I think that the common problem is that situation is that haven't actually asked for the sale or moved the customer journey onto the next step, which is a close, but not necessarily closing on the product. And a lot of times people do all this great work and they go, great, excellent, fantastic. They're not pulling the credit card out. What do I do next? As opposed to, hey, so how do you want to pay for that? Oh, actually, that's a good question. I'm not quite yet. Oh, and now we've got an objection. So I think the first and foremost thing is why we often don't get objections, because we don't actually ask for the sale to push to that point of the objection to come up. All right. So that's probably the first lesson to take, and probably the easiest one to solve. And pretty much the majority of people we work with, that they stop at the actually asking for the next step in that sale, or next step in the customer journey, or asking for the order would be the old way of saying it. But we now know that there's generally a number of touch points in a customer journey. So you need to be moving the person on to the next part of that journey, which is a closing the next step, until you're actually to the point of asking for the order to close it. I think the other thing that comes up in there is sometimes people are a little bit fearful of conflict. And again, I'll put that back onto the salesperson here, where they haven't actually built enough rapport for that person to feel safe to be able to honestly ask and go through and do that. And the third thing is that I think sometimes we don't actually ask deep enough questions and ask questions enough to be able to allow the person to create permission for them to give the objection in there. And of course, you can go through and you can handle all the objections you get through the sales process, but you're not going to actually identify what's the actual objection the person's got until I actually voice it. And I like saying in the context of sales, no doesn't mean no unless you've handled an objection. So you need to make sure that you're creating the space, doing everything you can to create a safe space for that trust, for that person to actually bring up a genuine objection, as opposed to, I just need to talk to my partner, or I need to think about it, or I'm just looking.
Love it.
So Chantal, tell me, what techniques help uncover a hidden no before it kills the deal?
Yeah, I think I think that you covered a few of these things in the last question, and I think definitely people need permission to know that they can raise any concerns. And so if we're not expressly giving that permission and inviting people to ask as many questions or trial closing to see, is there anything in what we just presented there that isn't landing for you or that didn't meet the problem that you presented us with, then we're not actually getting feedback. That when you're not getting feedback during that sales process, then the only time they can give you feedback is when they say no. So I think it's really about touch points and pulse checks along the way. Now you might have them built into your sales system, like a really good sales system that has rhythm will have those things built in along the way, or it might just be the processes of the relationship touch points to being able to do that. Essentially what we really need to do is set a safe context for people to give honesty around where they're at. And in order to do that, we have lots of people who are what some would be referred to as people pleasers. And so the idea of telling you that they don't like their promotion, that they don't like your proposal, could be terrifying for them, because what if they upset you and you might take it personally, or you could cry, or you could get angry. So sometimes people don't always know that it's okay for them to give you feedback about something that doesn't land or that does land. And as you get into more strategic sales, as opposed to transactional sales, that feedback mechanism is almost expected. And so if you're looking to develop your sales career to move from transactional selling into more strategic based selling, then you need to be okay with asking for the feedback and knowing that the higher up your decision makers and your champions are, the more they're going to be giving you that feedback, and they're probably not going to be worried about how it lands with you either. So I think that's really important. It's about setting safe context for people to share feedback, but it's also about your resilience to actually take that feedback. Sometimes as salespeople, we don't ask for feedback because maybe we know that it's not going to be favorable. So you need to build some thick skin. And as an old sales manager once said to me, you've got to have a nice big glass of harden up sometimes.
A lot of people like that. They just want to have the script. It's just, how do we get the script? I want the script to work. I mean, how do I make sure, I'll recall the conversation that I'd have because I'm a great closer, and I'll put this script together and give it to someone else to go through and do it, and then wonder why it just doesn't seem to work. And I think it's a big part of the problem we have in today is that people like the path of least resistance, and they're not willing to have the critical thinking. And if that's the case, then what you're doing is you're leaving someone a yes-no process to move through the sales process without actually building a connection with somebody and being able to realize that it's not a conversation that can be scripted. There's certainly some bullet points and a journey and some high-level sort of levels to go through, but you can't have a conversation that's scripted that's going to be personal and dial into that emotional connection. I'm sure we've all had a phone ring where the person's launched straight into their spiel, and you can tell they're reading from a script in that scenario, and it's nothing big a turn off. Even someone polished reading a script, it still doesn't sort of hit the mark, because unless that script is build rapport with the client on phone. As the first part of the script, everything else is going to fall down. So yes, you need a structure and a process. Building that and having the confidence of your customer journey, your confidence of what every conversation is to start and finish, and having some questions that you can go through at a high level to make sure you're getting in there is a great way of doing that. At the end of the day, we need to be able to have rapport. And we need to, and often find that when we start dialing back and looking at scripts and a bit more a too structured process, it gets in the way of us building rapport and doing the process naturally and communicating as we should with another human being. So unless you've got some kind of inability to be able to talk to another human being, and again, we're noticing that the generations now are having to learn how to have a conversation that's not through a text to the person beside you. It's a skill that's being lost through technology, and unless you're having a real problem being able to have a very basic conversation with someone, the scripts are a great way to have a big picture plan, but certainly not a word for word process to go through. It's just going to get in the way of you building rapport with that person and being able to be fluid in the conversation and the customer journey to adapt the conversation to suit that particular individual through deeper questionings and the outcome from there. Chandel, you and I both had people go, I just wish I could have you on my shoulder when these things happen. The words come out of your mouth so brilliantly. Let me write that down. I'm going to use that scenario, right? And again, I think that's an example where people are looking for someone to do the hard work for them in writing that script in that scenario. So, tell me, why do scripts are especially ineffective with today's informed buyers?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question, Brad, because there was a time in history, certainly at the beginning of my sales career, if you had a guideline script or, there was a sheet that you used and, you followed along, and as long as you added your own kind of personality to that script and that tone, you could succeed with that. That being said, I think it's, a lot to talk about the fact that buyers know what they want today. They're much more educated, and technology makes it possible for people to have as much information that they need at their fingertips within seconds. I mean, when we look at not just the way in which Google and search engine technology has taken over, we're also looking at AI and learning models now. And so, people are not necessarily doing a lot of the thinking for themselves right now. They do a little bit of research. They ask all of the guides. And so when you come along with a set train tracks, follow the rigidity of a script that has not been adapted or adjusted for the person that's sitting in front of you, your buyers are going to detect that inauthenticity, and they really will value more a dialogue and a conversation to make sure that they know that you know what their problem is and how you're going to solve it. And sometimes you can be educating your audience and help them to understand that you really do understand their challenges. And they'll say things to you like, have you got cameras here in my office? I can totally, like, everything that you've said is what's going on here. Are you like watching us? And then other times you can see from the look on their face that they actually have no idea about the fact that you get what's going on for them. So I think this comes back to, there's got to be some adaptability, some flexibility. You need to meet your audience where they're at, and different industries will use different lingo. Different industries will have different preferences in the way they want to see the information from you. Different humans will have bad experiences that they're going to be judging you by, good experiences that they're going to be comparing you to. And sometimes people don't compare apples for apples and oranges for oranges. So I think it's really important that we should never make any assumptions about any situation that is a buying situation that we've walked into, or any situation for anything for that matter. But certainly in a buying situation, we can't have a cookie cutter approach because we don't have a cookie cutter world.
Yeah, bye-bye cookie cutter.